promised, today we're going to be talking about hard disk images, not only for the IBM 5150, but also the XT5160 and all the PC variants, basically anything that uses an MFM hard drive controller, the controller named HDC in MAME. So more specifically, we're talking about something like the IBM fixed disk adapter, which connects up to an MFM hard drive. We could also be talking about something like a Western Digital controller as well, which is very similar. This is the page from -0degrees.net, and if we take a look down at the bottom here, they have a variation 3 of this controller, which if you look carefully, there's a set of dip switches here, which you can change. And these dip switches are the hard drive settings that actually show up in MAME. In my previous video, we showed that if you look under the dip switches, you have these settings for the first drive and the second drive. You have an option to select between 0 and 3 because there are 2 switches for each drive, allowing you to select one of 4 different types. So how do you find out what types of hard drives you can actually use? There's a utility called SpeedStor, which we can run to determine what hard drive types are in the ROM. So let's run that. It's on my B drive. And the option that we want is called ROM list. Takes a moment to load this. But here we go. So this is telling us the cylinders and heads for the 4 different types of drives that we can select on this controller. I wanted to point out that the default is actually not type 0. The default is actually type 3. So what that means is if you select 0 here, you're actually selecting 3. Why? The reason why this is backwards is because the jumpers are actually pull down rather than pull up. I can explain this by looking at the schematic, which I will pull up here. Here is page 1 of the fixed disk controller schematic, and right here, these are the 4 dip switches. Note that they have a 1K resistor pulling it up to 5 volts. If all of these switches are off and they're not closed, it means that these 4 lines are all pulled up. That means they're all 1. And that means that you're actually selecting type 3 by default if none of the switches are closed. If you close the switches, it pulls them down to ground. So this is how I know that having all the switches set to 0 in MAME means that my hard drive is going to be type 3, which means it's 615 cylinders and 4 heads. So the closest drive I could find to this is actually a Seagate 225. The pre-compensation is not quite correct. I couldn't really find any drive that was closer than this. The Seagate 225, which is a 5 1/4 half height drive, is clearly 615 cylinders and 4 heads with 17 sectors. 17 sectors being standard for MFM hard drives. Now we need to create a hard drive image that has this geometry. There are different ways that you can do this, but the way that I like to do it is to use a utility called CHD man. I like to use CHD format because you can actually tell it exactly what the geometry of the drive is. And MFM does not have automatic geometry detection, like the drive itself doesn't know what the geometry is. You have to actually tell all the software that. Good thing about CHD is when you create an image, you actually can tell it what the geometry is. CHD man create HD. And we have the options. So the output test.chd, and we can tell it the CHS. So we needed 615. Let's just double check this. Yeah, here's good. 615, 4, and 17. Okay. Now I have test.chd with 615, 4, and 17. And I can go ahead and attach this image to my machine over here. Okay, we have an MS-DOS hard disk at the moment. I'm going to disconnect this one and connect the one that we just made and then reboot. And it was called test.chd, and that's our hard drive image. Okay, now I'm going to need to reboot this. So I'm going to use the MS-DOS 3.3a, floppy 1 for the moment, and I'm going to reset the system, and we'll come back when that's booted up with the hard drive attached. All right, so now that I have the drive attached, I can go ahead and partition it. Create a partition, use the entire thing, yes. And the system will restart. Okay. So now we can format the drive. And we'll come back when this is finished. Okay, formatting is finished. Now we should have a bootable drive. Before we reboot, let's just finish the DOS install. We need to change floppy disks in order to finish this install. We want to go to floppy 2. Okay. Copying files is all done. So now let's just get rid of a floppy drive. And reboot. Oh, and there we go. We just installed MS-DOS 3.3 on hard drive image that we created. So this was what I was actually going to show you in today's video, how to figure out what hard drive image type to use, how to figure out what parameters to use to create a hard drive image using the default settings. You of course can use some of the other settings or some of the other drive types that are listed in this ROM. The problem with that is if you're expecting other people to use these other images, you will have to tell them, types 0, 1, or 2. You will have to tell other people what hard drive type to use. Like, type 2 is either a 30 or 40 megabyte hard drive. But if you are going to give the image to people, you would have to tell them, to use this hard drive image, you have to go to your dip switches on this drive, and you have to change it to type 1. But mostly you don't want people to mess around. I recommend that you just use, in the ROM list, use the type 3. In MAME, you have the jumper set to 0, and nobody has to change anything away from the default. Alright, so in my next video, we're actually going to show installing FreeDOS on MAME's emulation of the IBM5150. So I hope you join me for that episode. Bye everyone.